The courtroom was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made everything feel heavier. The only sound was the faint shuffle of papers being moved and the occasional nervous cough from someone in the gallery. At the front of the room stood a young man, barely out of his teens, his face pale and his eyes downcast. His shoulders were hunched as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him, and every inch of his body seemed to exude defeat. His hands, clasped tightly together, trembled slightly, betraying the fear and anxiety that gripped him. His lawyer, a middle-aged man with a tired look in his eyes, leaned in to speak with him urgently, but it was clear from Michael's expression that he already knew what was coming. This wasn't going to end well for him. The defendant, Michael, had been charged with trespassing. According to the arresting officer, he had been found outside a business after hours, wandering aimlessly and possibly trying to break into the building. But Michael insisted that he had simply been waiting for his friend to pick him up. He had no ill intentions. He had no criminal record, no history of trouble, and yet here he was, standing trial in front of a judge who seemed determined to make sure the scales of justice were never tipped in his favor. The judge, Judge Randall, was a man known for his hard stance on cases involving young people from certain backgrounds, especially if they were poor or from disadvantaged communities. He was older, with a sharp gaze and a permanent scowl on his face, and he had earned a reputation for being dismissive of defendants he considered to be troublemakers. His courtroom was his domain, and from the moment Michael stepped inside, he could feel the tension in the air. There was no warmth in the room, just the cold, dispassionate eyes of a man who had already made up his mind. As the trial began, Michael's lawyer presented a clear argument. The prosecution had no solid evidence. There were no security cameras capturing Michael's alleged crime, no physical evidence tying him to the scene, and no witnesses who could attest to what had actually happened. Michael had been waiting outside, not breaking any laws, just killing time until his ride arrived. But Judge Randall barely listened. He stared down at Michael with an air of disinterest, tapping his fingers on the desk as though bored by the proceedings. When Michael's lawyer finished speaking, Judge Randall leaned back in his chair and sighed loudly, as if he couldn't care less. "This court has more important matters to address," Judge Randall declared in a tone dripping with disdain. His words echoed through the courtroom, making it clear that he considered Michael's case to be a waste of time. He turned to the prosecutor, who was sitting nearby, waiting for his turn to speak. "Anything to add?" the judge asked, though his voice suggested that he had already made up his mind. The prosecutor, a young man who seemed to be just starting out in his legal career, looked up nervously. He clearly didn't want to challenge the judge, who had an air of authority that made everyone in the room uneasy. But he had a job to do, and he had been instructed to make sure Michael paid for his alleged crime. "Nothing further, Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice faltering slightly. Michael's lawyer, however, wasn't ready to give up. He stood up again, his voice growing more desperate as he spoke. "Your Honor, we have evidence, photographs, time stamps that prove my client wasn't trespassing. We also have several witnesses who can attest to his character. This case should never have come this far." Judge Randall, however, was unmoved. He waved his hand dismissively, cutting the lawyer off. "Enough," he said with finality. "I've heard enough. This case is going nowhere." His tone was cold, almost as if he were irritated that they were wasting his time. He reached for his gavel, preparing to dismiss the case entirely. It seemed like the end for Michael. His lawyer had nothing else to say, and the judge was clearly uninterested in hearing more. Michael could feel the weight of his defeat settling on him like a heavy blanket. It was as if all hope had vanished, and there was nothing left to do but accept that justice was never going to be on his side. But just as the gavel was about to fall, something unexpected happened. The doors to the courtroom creaked open. It was a sound that cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Everyone turned to look. The man who walked through the doors was tall, sharply dressed, and carried himself with an air of authority that immediately silenced the room. His presence seemed to fill the space, demanding attention without saying a word. The stranger's gaze swept across the courtroom, and when his eyes landed on Judge Randall, the judge froze. His hand, which had been inches away from the gavel, now hovered in the air, trembling slightly. The moment was strange, almost surreal, as though time itself had come to a halt. The stranger didn't speak at first. He simply walked confidently to the front of the room, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor, and waited for the judge to acknowledge him. "Excuse me, Your Honor," the stranger said, his voice steady and firm. It was a voice that commanded demanded respect, and despite the judge's initial irritation, the words seemed to settle heavily in the air. Judge Randall's face shifted from annoyance to confusion. "And who might you be?" he asked, though his tone carried a hint of unease. The stranger didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a leather-bound wallet, and flashed a badge. "Special Counsel James Harris, Department of Justice," he said. The room was silent for a moment. The badge was real, and the name carried weight. The gasps in the courtroom were almost audible. No one had expected this. Special Counsel James Harris was a man of great influence, known for his high-profile cases and unflinching commitment to justice. His presence here, at this moment, was nothing short of a shock. "I'm here on behalf of the Attorney General's office," Harris continued, locking eyes with Judge Randall, "and I've been monitoring this case very closely." Judge Randall's confident demeanor faltered for the first time. He looked down at the papers in front of him, as if to regain some semblance of control, but the shift in his posture was visible. "Monitoring? This is a simple trespassing case," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier authority. Harris took a step forward, and the room seemed to shrink around them. "Simple?" he asked, his voice growing colder. "From where I stand, it looks like a clear case of judicial misconduct." The entire courtroom went silent. Judge Randall's face, once filled with disdain, now paled. He quickly banged his gavel, trying to regain control, but the usual authority wasn't there. "Order! I will not tolerate disruptions in my courtroom," he barked, but his words lacked their usual weight. Harris didn't flinch. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unyielding, "before you dismiss this case, I suggest you review these documents." So he handed a thick file to the clerk, who brought it swiftly to Judge Randall. The judge, still looking flustered, opened the file. As he flipped through the pages, his face grew paler with each passing second. The documents weren't just about Michael's case. They contained evidence not only of Michael's innocence, but also records of Judge Randall's history of disproportionately harsh rulings against young people from marginalized backgrounds. The more the judge read, the more his discomfort became visible. He shifted in his seat, his hand trembling as it hovered over the papers. The weight of what he was reading was sinking in, and he could no longer deny the truth that had been staring him in the face for so long. For the first time in his career, Judge Randall seemed to hesitate. His usual arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a visible unease. Michael's lawyer stood up again, seizing the opportunity. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency, "in light of this new evidence, I move to dismiss the charges against my client." Judge Randall hesitated. His hand, which had previously hovered confidently over the gavel, now trembled as he placed it down slowly. He looked around the room, trying to gather his thoughts, but it was clear he was struggling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he nodded. "The charges are dismissed," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The room erupted into applause. Michael's mother, sitting quietly in the back, wiped away the tears that had begun to flow. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael allowed himself a small smile. He had done it. He had won. But Harris wasn't finished yet. "One more thing, Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the celebration. "The Department of Justice will be conducting a formal review of your conduct on the bench." Judge Randall didn't respond. He simply stood up and left the courtroom, not a word of apology or acknowledgement passing his lips. His exit was quick, almost as if he was trying to escape the weight of the moment. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Michael and his lawyer made their way over to Harris. "Thank you," Michael's lawyer said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've saved my client's life." Harris nodded, but his expression was calm. Justice should never depend on who's sitting on the bench or what background a defendant comes from. "Everyone deserves a fair shot," he said. His tone was firm but compassionate, as if he had seen this kind of injustice more times than he cared to count. Michael, still in shock, stood beside his lawyer, his eyes wide as he tried to process what had just happened. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. A stranger had walked into that courtroom, someone whose presence had completely shifted shifted the balance of power. It was surreal, like a scene from a movie. But this wasn't fiction. It was his reality now. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as the emotions of the moment began to flood in. For so long, he had felt like an outsider, as if the world was stacked against him. Today, he had been on the verge of losing everything. But now, with the charges dismissed, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the legal victory, but for the reminder that justice, true justice, could still prevail. As Michael left the courtroom, he turned to his lawyer. I don't know how to thank him, he said, still processing the gravity of it all. His lawyer gave him a reassuring pat on the back. Sometimes, it just takes one person to stand up when everyone else turns away. That's what happened today. Outside the courthouse, Michael's mother was waiting for him, her eyes filled with tears of relief. She hugged him tightly, and for a moment, everything seemed to fade away. The long months of uncertainty, the fear, the anxiety, they were all gone. Her son had been given a second chance, a chance he almost hadn't had. But as they walked down the courthouse steps together, Michael's mind couldn't help but wander. The strange man who had intervened, special counsel James Harris, had changed everything. What if he hadn't been there? What if Judge Randall had dismissed the case without hesitation, as he had planned to? It didn't bear thinking about. What mattered now was that the right thing had been done, even when it seemed impossible. Later that evening, Michael sat in his room, reflecting on the events of the day. He thought about the judge's dismissive attitude, the sense of hopelessness that had gripped him, and how quickly everything had shifted once Harris entered the room. It was a powerful reminder of how fragile justice could be, how easily it could be swayed by the biases of those in power. But it was also a reminder of something else, the power of standing up when things seemed hopeless, the power of one person, one voice, to make a difference. Michael knew that his life had been changed today, not just because of the outcome of the case, but because of the example set by someone like Harris, who refused to let an injustice go unchallenged. The next day, the news spread quickly. The story of the young man who had narrowly avoided a wrongful conviction thanks to a mysterious stranger became a headline in the local papers. People talked about the courage it took for Harris to intervene, for him to confront the judge's prejudice head on. It was a story of hope, of standing up to injustice, and of the power of one person to make a difference. As for Judge Randall, the scrutiny he faced didn't stop with the dismissal of the case. The Department of Justice began its investigation into his conduct, and soon after, reports surfaced of previous complaints about his bias. There was talk of a formal review of his judicial record, and though he tried to maintain his position, the cracks in his reputation were beginning to show. But none of that mattered to Michael. What mattered to him was that he had been given a second chance at life, a chance he would never take for granted again. And as he walked forward into his future, he knew that his story, his fight for justice, was far from over. And so, the case that had started with so much uncertainty ended not just with the dismissal of charges, but with a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. The world, it seemed, still had a place for people like special counsel James Harris, who were willing to confront the truth and challenge the status quo. They were the ones who reminded us all that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for light to break through. As Michael walked out into the world with a newfound sense of hope, he knew one thing for certain: no matter where life took him from here, he would never forget the man who had walked into that courtroom and changed everything. His life had been saved by a single act of courage, and that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life.